Am I supposed to be doing something here to get my picture off the screen?
You were just fine.
Am I okay?
Thanks so much.
I'll just
Yep.
stay here.
Yep. And for those who are joining, we are giving it just a moment for everybody that is participating to come on, and we'll start our dialogue. All right, well, let's get underway. Thank you so much for joining us, and happy Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. My name is Wade Crowfoot, and I lead the California Natural Resources Agency. We're one of two large environmental agencies in the state of California focused on protecting our nature and protecting our communities from the impacts of climate change, helping everybody get outdoors, and so much more. Some of you have participated before in the Secretary Speaker Series, but for those who haven't, welcome. We do dialogues like this once or twice a month where we bring leaders from across California, big thinkers, where we talk about priorities of our agency and of Californians. And so today, of course, we celebrate Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. We're really proud at the Natural Resources Agency and across state government to celebrate, to recognize our diverse backgrounds and all that makes us Californians. And so today and this month, we have an opportunity to celebrate our Asian American and Pacific Islander cultures and history in California. We've got a dynamite set of speakers here today to share more, to teach us about this culture and to talk about how we're reflecting this culture and continuing to educate our next generations about the contributions of the Asian American communities, Pacific Islander communities. So should be a great conversation. A few things about this discussion you should be aware of. The first is that we use the chat function that many of you are probably familiar with at this point. If you open up the chat function, my colleague Geeta Chandra, who is responsible for organizing these public dialogues, is going to be populating that chat box with important and helpful information links on our speakers, their organizations, and topics that get discussed. So if you leave the chat box open, you'll be able to get some great resources. I'll also mention that we also have a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So at any point during our discussion today, you can tap that Q&A button and type in a question or an observation, and we'll see those questions as panelists. Some of those we'll answer in writing immediately, and others we'll try to bring into the conversation when we bring our speakers together as a group. We are recording the conversation, so there'll be an opportunity to go back and to listen to the conversation if that's helpful, but also share with others. In about a day's time at our agency website, which is resources.ca.gov, you'll be able to find a recording of this discussion as well as a list of the helpful links that were provided through chat. So let's jump into the conversation. We have, as I said, a remarkable set of leaders, of thinkers with us here today. Geeta's going to go ahead and put that in the chat function to identify our leaders. And if I can find the document here, I'm gonna share with you a quick summary of the leaders we have with us today. But let's start off with our first. Oh, here we are. Thanks so much. I'm actually in a remote location and dealing sort of toggling technology. But today we're going to be joined by my colleague and friend Julie Polanco, who leads our Office of Historic Preservation, and she's going to help us understand about how this office is really bringing to life California's diverse cultures, including those we'll celebrate today. We have Dr. Kristen Hayashi, who serves as Director of Collections Management and Access and Curator for the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. We have Dr. Dorothy Fujita Roni, who is a professor of Asian American Studies at UC Irvine. And we have Lori Watanuki, a former San Mateo Public Works Commissioner and co-founder of the Central Neighborhood Association in San Mateo. And the arc of this conversation, I really am excited about. I had an opportunity to to meet our panelists yesterday and excited for all of their contributions. So Julie, you're first up. You are the State Historic Preservation Officer, and you lead the State Office of Historic Preservation. If you would, help us understand this function within government and how actually it's centrally relevant to what we're celebrating here on AAPI Heritage Month.
Thanks, Wade, and thanks for having us today. So the Office of Historic Preservation in California, and there's one in every state in the Union, implements programs that do a couple of things. We celebrate and commemorate historic sites on registers like the California Register of Historic Places, the National Register of Historic Resources, and then the state landmark programs. The National Historic Landmark Program is administered by our partners at the National Park Service, as well as our office functions in a review capacity for projects that use federal funds or for state-owned projects to really review and understand the effects of those projects, things like dams and rivers, roads, things that our public needs to live, clean water. All of those projects come through our office for a review to understand how historic properties are considered in those projects so that we can steward them at the same time as we're providing these public services. So, and then the other thing that we do very well and often is work with local governments on their programs of recognition, of celebrating and commemorating the stories of their communities. But one of the ways that we do that is within the context of the National Register of Historic Places. And today we're going to focus on something that's called a multiple property submission document, or commonly known as a historic context statement. And this is a process by which we document stories associated with place to nominate them to the National Register of Historic Places, and thereby they get automatically listed on the California Register of Historical Resources. And sometimes it's to update a property with a new history or a new context. Traditionally, the National Register has been about buildings, historic districts, and archaeology, where the focus of the programs at the state, local, and national level. Also, historically, underrepresented communities did not control or even have access to living in certain neighborhoods. And then with urbanization and different types of things that happened over the years that saw these buildings demolished or neighborhoods affected, we think that these are factors that are leading to a lack of representation by these communities on the state and national registers. During the past few decades, there's been an increase in recognition of cultural heritage, traditional cultural landscapes, things that really celebrate and commemorate intangible heritage. So moving a bit away from a place-based recognition program, but really beginning to understand how we can look at these histories differently, how we can account for them, celebrate them, understand them, so that we can know more about our shared history. And in the State Office of Historic Preservation, we're leading the way to change this dynamic of underrepresentation. It is critical that we bring the experiences, contributions, and achievements of all our communities out of the shadows and into the light. In doing so, we add to the layers of the rich mosaic that's our shared history in California, and we have a lot to celebrate. We learned that we're more alike than different, that we all want things to help us celebrate with our families, to have opportunities to educate our children, and to see them thrive as they make their dreams and put them into action. So we're building better together. And how do we do this in the framework of the National Register? Well, let's step back a little bit. A primary way for places to be listed is through the formal nomination process. And this is a two-step process that requires a nomination to talk about the context of the history. Let's say Art Deco in the 1930s. And then how that specific site, a building in San Francisco, is able to convey the significance, is able to tell the story of that history. Levels of sophistication in the writing of these nominations have gotten with a lot of great scholarship and research, and also tend to now cost a lot of money. We've sort of backed ourselves into a profession that is really polished and shown these histories in an amazing way, but also unintentionally creates barriers to entry. So in creating and making these historic context statements, the nominators can use the context statement for the history, for the background of the story they're trying to tell, and leave them to focus their time and money and limited resources on the specifics of their property. In this way, we hope that we are removing the barriers to entry for community members and to encourage more nominations to celebrate and commemorate the things that they hold dear. In crafting the historic context statements in California, we do it in a unique way. We work in collaboration with an advisory committee that's comprised of community members, scholars, local organizations, and experts from all around the state, people who are connected to their communities. And with staff in our contracts, this team helps us identify themes and stories and sites that might be considered for nomination. Our partners are rooted in their communities. And so, if you will, we're sort of crowdsourcing this information, but we're doing so in a way that allows the communities to tell us what's important to them rather than us telling them what they need to save. In this effort and all the efforts in our office, we always consider how we are changing the tides of equity to help create justice for all. And in doing so, I think that we are helping create a California and National Register for all. So in 2017, the National Park Service published a document called Finding a Path Forward, the Asian American Pacific Islander National Historic Landmark Theme Study. And building upon that, in 2018, partially funded by the National Park Service's Underrepresented Communities Grant, California undertook Asian Pacific Islanders in the 20th Century California. This document was approved by the Keeper of the National Register in 2020, and it had three main themes: migration and community formation, community serving organizations, and religion and spirituality. There were 8 groups that were represented, from Native Hawaiians, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, Filipino Americans, Chamorro, South Asian Americans, and Samoans. And the period of significance was from 1850 to 1970. So a really big stretch of history, a lot of contributions to the development of our state, the things that we know and see and love. These documents are living documents, meaning they can be amended. And in 2024, the Keeper of the National Register in Washington, D.C. approved an amendment that extends the period of significance to 1995, adds 2 historic context statements: business, industry, and labor, and activism, civil engagement, and political participation, and a 9th group of community members, Vietnamese Americans. To date, there have been 8 properties under this context: Chinatown Gardens Archaeological District, the Chinese Shrimp Camp in Marin County, the Grand Oriente Filipino Hotel, which was determined eligible, the Japanese YMCA in San Francisco, in Sacramento, the Nisei VFW Post, the Royal Theater, the Vernon School. And we're pleased to have Lori Watanaki with us. Her property, the Yamanouchi Yoshioko House in San Mateo County. The Hawaiians say that it's our kuleana, our responsibility, but it's a responsibility that's greater, one to our ancestors and to our community members, to listen, to learn, to celebrate and commemorate the stories of our neighbors, friends, coworkers, and mentors, to serve all of our public with pride and honor. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in California is one of several context statements that we're working on, that we've worked on in our office. In 2015, and this nomination has been twice amended, Latinos in the 20th Century California was a theme study that followed on a national theme study, and likewise was done at the same time as the City and County of Los Angeles. So in that context, we have national, state, and a pretty sizable local population of California, all with different and similar studies and themes telling the stories important to those communities. We're especially proud in 2023 to work with 20+ California tribes to create the first document Native Americans in the California mission system. So adding a layer of a context for which we're all familiar, but from the voice of the ancestors of those who actually experienced it. These tribes worked alongside our contractors and staff to identify the themes and to tell the stories of their families through that mission context statement. As I mentioned, it's the first in the country to really tie tribal stories to the National Register in a context statement. We're really excited about the study to show how Western frameworks can serve as additional tools for tribes to tell their stories while we all learn at the same time. And finally, we're currently in the process of an African Americans in California historic context statement. We aim to continue until all the stories are represented and celebrated and commemorated.
Julie, that's really, really impressive. And I went on the link that Gita had shared in the chat function, and it's remarkable. This historic context statement is a couple few hundred pages long, really providing a really solid basis of understanding for all of the different Asian American Pacific Islander cultures that have flourished in California. And then that statement is kind of the foundation as you identify in other places, right? Buildings, places go through the National Historic Landmark process, right? Is that sort of how that works?
That's right. So the context statement can be used as the foundation for nominations to go through the National Register process. And so anybody can use it. They're available to the public. As you mentioned, they're on our website. They're free. We offer assistance if people have questions about how to use them. So we're really trying to eliminate that barrier to entry financially. A lot of local organizations don't have the funds, several hundreds or tens of thousands, I should say, of dollars to create these things. And so we're trying to find ways to hold the door open and invite communities to share and celebrate the things that are very important to them.
Wow, that's great. And Julie, I look forward to integrating you into the group conversation a little bit later. It's now my honor to introduce Dr. Kristen Hayashi, who, as I shared at the top of the discussion, helps to lead work at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. Dr. Hayashi, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
Yeah, so excited that you're here. And we've asked you to share some around the contributions of Japanese American communities to California, which is, of course, evolving and foundational to what California has become. So I want to just start with a very broad question, which is, how have Japanese Americans contributed to what we know as California and some of our key priorities like environmental justice?
Sure. Great. Thank you for that question. Hello, everyone. I'm currently joining you from the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. For the last 6.5 years, I've led the team that cares for the permanent collection here at JANM. And I also am one of the curators here, which means that I curate content around our collection for exhibition and for public programs like this one. So prior to working at JANM, I worked at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County for 11 years, mostly in the history department. And my major project there was working on a semi-permanent exhibition called Becoming Los Angeles, Stories of Nature and Culture, which I think will be of interest to many of you. It's an exhibition that explores how the land impacted Angelenos and how Angelenos impacted the land to create what is now this huge megalopolis. So it really talks about this nature culture nexus. So I invite you to visit the Natural History Museum to see that exhibition. So far we've been talking about how preservation of aspects of the built environment and intangible cultural heritage are this form of preservation. And I think museums do really complementary work. Museum collections preserve material culture, the stuff that represents everyday life, archives and artwork that really anchor stories of the past, help us to understand our present and guide our future. And I think JANM's collection is really unique because it tells the stories of seemingly ordinary individuals, but it's often the most mundane objects that I think represent some of the most compelling stories. So JANM's collection, it's essentially been amassed by a community, and it's a community telling its own narrative because this history is underrepresented in some of our mainstream and national museums. So it's really powerful for a place like JANM to exist. The material culture, photographs, and documents in our permanent collection here really show myriad ways in which Japanese Americans have shaped the landscape of California through their involvement in agriculture, floriculture, and horticulture. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to show just a few photographs from JANM's collection to talk about the ways in which Japanese Americans have shaped the landscape of California. And then I'll just talk through a couple of sites in Los Angeles that have been designated at various levels and have become landmark nominations as a way to sort of talk about the importance of the context statement that Julie just described. So this is a photograph of a family in a flower field in Compton, California, pre-World War II. And, despite the alien land law that was passed in 1913 that barred Asian immigrants from purchasing land since they were determined aliens ineligible for citizenship, Japanese immigrants really, found creative ways, and they were resilient to make the land really produce. And here's an example. So this photograph is just one of many that the Southern California Flower Market Association, which was a Japanese-owned flower market here in Los Angeles, produced. And they put these photographs together of families in their flower fields into these scrapbooks that they would sort of send out to the other flower growers. And I just love this photograph because, again, today, Compton and the Los Angeles basin looks completely different. But just imagine a time when flower fields really blanketed the Los Angeles basin. Outside of floriculture, Japanese Americans made huge impacts in agriculture as well. And before World War II, some 40% of the Japanese American population worked in agriculture. And so if you maybe bit into an apple before World War II, there's a high probability that that apple or that peach was produced by a Japanese American farmer. So go to the next slide, please. This is a photograph of gardeners, Japanese American, mostly men, were very active in really, like, literally shaping domestic, private, and public spaces in California. Gardeners like these men here were hired by wealthy white families in affluent neighborhoods like Beverly Hills, Brentwood, or Hollywood here in the greater Los Angeles area to really manicure their gardens. It was really in vogue to have a Japanese gardener create a Japanese garden aesthetic. Yet while the labor of Japanese gardeners was coveted, they weren't welcome to live in these neighborhoods. Racial housing covenants really barred them from living in the same neighborhoods where they worked. And yet, their labor was sort of invisible, but the product, I think, was something that has been really iconic of Southern California. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this is a story of the impact of Japanese Americans on floriculture. So this is Tokyo Florist. This is a very contemporary photo of it. It was located in Silver Lake. It closed in 2006, and a few colleagues and I worked to designate it through the city of Los Angeles as a historic cultural monument in 2019. But just to kind of take a step back, I'll tell you the story of Tokyo Florist. So in 1929, recently widowed Yuki Kawakami Sakai opened a flower shop on Los Feliz Boulevard in Los Feliz in Los Angeles, which she called Tokyo Florist. And despite not being a naturalized citizen and being susceptible to the alien land law, she really found creative ways to skirt the law and to keep company with other Japanese American flower farms and stands along Los Feliz Boulevard. Her flower stand, survived the Great Depression, but during World War II, she and her family, were forced to close up their shop, to leave their home and community, and they were incarcerated during the war. It took a while for Yuki to restart the family business upon returning to Los Angeles after World War II, but by the early 50s, she was able to restart the business. And in 1960, the family, now Yuki is assisted by her daughter, Sumi, they opened Tokyo Florist in Silver Lake at this location that you see here. And this was the family home, but it was also where the business was too. So right here, if you walked up the driveway under the porte cochere was Sumi's workshop. And so just imagine it was full of cut flowers that the family grew in the back. They had a greenhouse and a lot of land to grow flowers. And she would make these really fabulous arrangements for her customers. And so many people have these fond memories of coming up to the Tokyo Florist in Silver Lake and buying these flowers. And so when ownership was about to change in 2019, that's when we took action to really save this, because this is really the site that shows just Japanese American contributions to floriculture, and the structures that the family built really communicate that, even though it takes a little bit of imagination now. So in November of 2019, it became Los Angeles Historic Cultural Monument number 1198. And this is really important because AAPI sites are, grossly underrepresented among historic cultural monument designations at the city, at the state, and the national level. So in Los Angeles, there are some like 11 now sites that outwardly represent the Japanese American experience, despite the very long-standing history and the contributions that this community has made to Los Angeles over the years. And at the national level, I mean, only 1% or so of the sites in the National Register outwardly represent AAPI contributions, which is really staggering considering, again, the long-standing histories of these communities. So it's important to have, places like Tokyo Forest designated as historic cultural monuments or landmarks. And I will just give one more example. If we could just turn to the next slide. I think this is an interesting example because it kind of changes our perception of environmental or social justice. I think so often environmental justice is framed around natural resources, which is totally true. But, more broadly, I think environmental justice is about equitable access to a healthy environment. And this is a really good example. Asian immigrants and their descendants have been really fighting for over a century for issues in response to discriminatory legislation like the Alien Land Law. So in this case, in 1926, 5 Japanese immigrant doctors wanted to create a hospital because Japanese immigrants and other minorities didn't have the same access to equitable healthcare. And so they tried to establish this hospital in 1926. They were denied by the California Secretary of State, saying that they violated the Alien Land Law. Now, again, they didn't have the rights and privileges of citizens, but they used the court system to try to fight their case. They took their case to the California State Supreme Court and won. And then it was challenged and it went to the US Supreme Court in 1928, and they were victorious. And so the community really raised the money to build this hospital. And this is a photograph showing the opening of the hospital on December 1st, 1929. And so it's this real like civil rights victory to try to create something that the community really needed. And so in 2015, I authored the nomination for this on behalf of the Little Tokyo Historical Society. And it was designated by the city of Los Angeles as Historic Cultural Monument 1131. And then I worked with the SHPO's office to try to get it on the National Register. Unfortunately, the owner was not in favor of having it go onto the National Register, which I think really shows just the need for education amongst community members too about the benefits of historic designation. But I think that these two examples really, or I guess what I've shared today, just to kind of wrap things up, is just kind of echoing some of the themes that are in this context statement, and to give some examples of the types of places that can become, historic landmark designations.
Well, Dr. Hayashi, thank you so much. I mean, such powerful stories. And I love the use of the photographs, and I'm sure everybody else does, judging by some of the emojis that were coming across the screen here. And I think you did such a nice job of explaining the importance of preserving, recognizing, sharing these places as important places to celebrate culture. So thanks for all the work that you do, not only at the museum, but clearly across Los Angeles to preserve these incredible places, and then to be able to help us, understand the stories behind them. So very, very excited for all the work that you do, and excited to bring you into the group conversation. Okay. But now I'm going to introduce Dr. Fujita Roni. And as I shared at the top of our discussion, she works at the University of California, Irvine, teaching Asian American Studies. So Professor, great to have you here. And we were talking a little bit as we got to know each other around the importance of the work that's been talked about here today, being generative for younger generations of students, particularly those from underrepresented communities. So maybe I'd ask you to introduce yourself, but with an opening question of like, how do these processes to recognize, to designate historic properties, how are they actually impacting, the generation of students that you're teaching, particularly those from the Asian American community and as well as underrepresented communities? So welcome.
Thank you. Sorry. And it's an honor to be here. I really appreciate it and the generous introduction. To give you a sense of my background, I actually first got interested in Asian American studies as an undergraduate in the early 80s. And I think so much of what the work that has been done here really underscores me how we rest on the legacies of those who have gone before in terms of documenting neighborhoods and articulating for Asian American studies. And I too was very much a beneficiary of that. After college, I worked in New York Chinatown for a few years, really learning from those who came before, not only the old timers, quote unquote, who came shortly after the 20th century, but also the activists. And I think being immersed in that kind of environment where place is so important, especially because of segregation and exclusion, it really underscores how crucial it is to retain stories of sight, especially when properties change so much, restaurants disappear. I also was very fortunate to go to for my doctoral dissertation at Yale University to work in Seattle, Chinatown, where I learned from the Filipino American National Historical Society and the activists there to really consider the importance of neighborhood and place. And I think that for myself, because that was so crucial to how I thought about history, being able to walk through the neighborhoods and see the stores, being able to have the stories, similar to what Dr. Hayashi was saying, being related about these places, it made me also really determined to think about how do we transmit this to the next generation. Here at UC Irvine, I am very close to Little Saigon, which is another amazing community that has changed so rapidly and has all these sites. As an educator, I have been thinking about these issues very much in relationship to my students, how to make it relevant, how to convey the excitement and the importance of space and place. And there, I see, having taught here now for a few decades, there's definitely different challenges that we face with the contemporary generation as we look ahead towards the future. One, of course, is that we've all been through COVID-19 and remote learning. And I think the relationship to place has shifted because of that. For many of my students, cyberspace is actually the space that they really think about the most, especially with social media. So what I try to do in my classes and in my teaching is really have people think about community formation and also about material culture. So I think it's tremendously important what people are doing in terms of documenting site, especially because of the preciousness of this legacy, that it is very, it shows the resistance and importance of people's experience, but it's also very fragile. So I think one of the challenges is also to teach students that a lot of times it'll take years for this history to be organized and documented, and for these places, and to have them really think about the future. I'm also particularly invested in, because there are so many AAPI communities, that we also move beyond, or not just move beyond, but really and are able, it's because it's not moving beyond, but to really kind of think about how the smaller communities can enter the picture too. I have so many students who are from the Cambodian community, for example, or other communities, the Vietnamese community, of course, which is one of the main student groups that I work with. And so I think that one of the reasons why work like this is so important is because I think we have to be moving on the ground and seeing how students understand things, but also to be thinking about the future. And now, as an older person, I think one of the things that I try to convey is the importance of time, that we have to take the time to do this work. That time is very precious, to listen to stories, and to also think about what do we want to leave for future generations, especially with the new ethnic studies curriculum mandate in California. It's all the more important that these resources be generated, but also that we teach younger generations how to do it. And hopefully inspire them to continue the work, if I may say so humbly. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pergiuderoni. And I wanted to ask you a follow-up question because your job is fascinating in that, it sounds like you're teaching the history, but these are evolving histories, evolving narratives across our Asian American communities. And so how do you, what are the recent developments or historical reassessments that you find most compelling, and how are you sort of integrating this evolution of culture and cultures into your teaching and work?
Well, I think two main things I can say right now is I think back in the 70s and 80s, and it continues to the present, but I think there's more emphasis on preserving forgotten communities or articulating representation. And luckily, we are at the stage now, and people have talked about it in terms of resources, that we should go deeper, think about our relationship to the land, to the different indigenous communities, settler colonialism, in terms of what it means to be coming after, and using these resources, and our relationship to the economy has also emerged as really significant. I think also very much, I think the recent years of just social unrest has really challenged us to think more deeply about communities' relationships to each other. That is not just about our own community, but to look at the layered relationships and how any place is formed by many, many communities. And to also deeply recognize the inequities, the silences that might emerge. So I think part of it is also thinking about what is the California that we want? How do we listen to each other and not just be inclusive, but also to recognize that we navigate vast inequities and challenges. So quickly, I know that my time is soon up. In terms of thinking about methodologies, I think thinking about oral history and how to get students to listen to stories is very key, because I think that is a skill that we have to really push as paramount. And the other thing too is to really think about underrepresented communities, and to put a priority on mentoring lesser documented communities, and to really seek out resources in creative ways, but also to, on a more foundational level, to think about how can we support other communities as well.
Wow. Well, huge thanks for your leadership and the work that you do on these topics and these priorities, and helping us be the California we want to be in terms of uplifting cultures and communities, however small they are, that create this incredible tapestry we have called California. So huge thanks for the work that you're doing. I next and finally want to introduce Lori Watanuki. As I shared, she is the co-founder of the Central Neighborhood Association in San Mateo, has volunteered as a public servant there, and actually can take us through a really interesting story of pursuing a National Register designation for her property and her grandmother's house. So Lori, first of all, great to have you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, so tell us your story if you would, and you've
Okay.
listened to
Oh, these
our
are fabulous stories I've been listening
yeah.
to.
So kind of so share your own story about the designation, and both your story in San Mateo, but then also the work trying to designate the house.
Yes, I worked on the Yoshiko Yamanouchi house, which is a historic district in the central neighborhood in San Mateo, California. And this is part of the oldest neighborhood on the east side of San Mateo. And recently we celebrated this new status onto the National Register and the AAPI register. And actually the mayor gave a special proclamation for the Yoshiko Yamanouchi Historic District. So I accepted this in the memory of my grandmother, Yoshiko Yamanouchi, who was a pioneer Issei, first generation Japanese American. And so this was really a wonderful honor, and I accepted that in her memory. And the process that I went through took over 30 years, actually, because a city council member mentioned this to me about 30 years ago. And I thought about it and thought about the Mills Act. And then I met Kristen Hayashi, who was a guest speaker here today, and she visited my home, and I was giving her some memorabilia that my grandmother owned, and to add to the collection in Los Angeles. And Kristen mentioned this historic preservation to me, and so I kept that in the back of my mind. But the third person was a architect who I worked with on different projects, and he mentioned that I really should get a historic preservation person involved. And as a result, I met Denise Bradley and Ward Hill. And one person covered the landscape portion, and the other person represented the building portion of our property. And they came up with this wonderful historic nomination package, which was 91 pages long, on the Yoshiko Yamanochi Historic District. And there are 9 contributors on this property. There are 3 gardens, 3 buildings, and 3 sites. And it covers the history of my grandmother from the inception of when the house was built and the garden in 1957 to 1973. And she had used the home and garden to strengthen East-West relationships, and the Prime Minister Eisaku Sato and his wife visited our home as well. But she had a deep appreciation for Japanese culture, and as a result shared this with many different groups. And as a result, we had a lot of visitors in our home. And so that's my story, basically. And I'm also the co-founder of the Central Neighborhood Association. And that's where the historic district is.
And Lori, if you would, talk about the historic district, because as I understand it, the Japanese American community, lived in a certain place of San Mateo for some, very clear reasons. And what's the goal of, sort of explain that history, if you would, and then what your Central Neighborhood Association is working to do?
Well, the Japanese Americans did not have an easy time in the early 1900s. My grandfather came in 1902 and in 1906 to San Mateo. And my grandmother came in 1915, and they were sort of like the pioneers in San Mateo. And they started a laundry business, and he also started the San Mateo Buddhist Church. And the Buddhist Church was very important. Excuse me. The San Mateo Buddhist Church was a very important part of the Japanese culture for the first generation. They had the Sunday school, which my grandmother started. They had the youth organization, and they had the women's association. So she developed each of these associations in San Mateo. And so that is where her recognition is within the Buddhist church, but she was also a businesswoman as well. And this was interrupted with the internment of the Japanese Americans. And also the Japanese couldn't live they had to live in specific parts of San Mateo. And it was defined as to where they could live. And it was between the 101 freeway and El Camino Real and Fifth Avenue, where we live, and Poplar. So it was a very designated area where they could live and have businesses. And so it wasn't an easy life for the Japanese Americans here in San Mateo, but when they came back, they all, if they were lucky, they were able to reclaim their businesses, and some were not as lucky. So we were one of the lucky ones, and one of the fortunate ones, I should say. And as a result, my grandmother had a great appreciation for Japanese culture, and she decided to build on to the family home. And as a result, we have 3 Japanese gardens and a Japanese structure called a katsura. And actually, there are 9 contributors on this site. But we have shared this with the community, and it was a process that I thought about for a very long time, and I'm happy that I made that decision.
Wow. Well, huge thanks for sharing the story. I mean, for making the decision and being a community leader, and for sharing your story. Not only the designation of the property, which sounds incredible, but also just the arc of history for Japanese Americans in San Mateo. Really helpful to understand.
I also wanted to mention that some neighborhoods are impacted by different projects. And our neighborhood in particular is impacted by the 101-92 connector project. And on the other side of our neighborhood, we're going to have the high-speed rail. So it is important to document the historic resources, because what happens is you have to have information to add to what's called an environmental impact report, and you need protection. And that's why it is so important to have these documents on a national register or an AAPI register, so that you can get mitigation. And it's important to get mitigation to protect your properties.
Huge point. Yeah. Big thanks for that. Hey, let's bring in all of our panelists for a group discussion here in the last 10 minutes. We've got some great questions coming in. And a reminder, we've got, almost, we've had almost 150 people join us throughout the discussion here today. If you have questions that you want to share with us, just tap the Q&A button and type in your question. One of the folks joining us today had a question for Dr. Fujita Roni. This person was taken on this concept of teaching students how to listen to stories and using stories to teach history. Can you just expand on that? Sort of, the importance of it, but then how do you work to do that?
Oh, excuse me, absolutely. I was very fortunate in that I grew up in a family of storytellers. And one of the things I learned too, or that I try to teach my students, it's the importance of listening, and that this is actually slow time, that this can't be compressed in like a soundbite, because I think that all of us are really bombarded now by, videos that are very short and are accessible in a different way. And I try to teach them that not only are the stories important, but they take place over time. The stories that we are told will change over time. Also, in terms of curriculum, to give them examples like oral history interviews. There are a number of websites now available. I've really have been thinking lately that it's not just about storytelling, it's about story listening. And we have to model these kinds of relationships, because that's how we get, I find, the richest information oftentimes about site, taking that time to really not only talk to community elders, but others in the community.
Yeah, it's incredible. And you're getting a lot of acknowledgement for those comments. And
Mhm.
even to spend an hour as we are, talking, it seems so rare in a culture that's increasingly multitasking and shorter snippets of information and entertainment. Dr. Hayashi, interested in your perspective on this, sort of sharing narratives, and what do you view as sort of progress moving forward in terms of sharing these stories and narratives? And I guess what do you, for those of us who don't do this work on a daily basis, how can we support, the work of the museum, the work that you're leading around the historic places? Sort of what do you see as the future, and how can we be helpful?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think for JANM especially, we are this ethnic specific museum, but we hope that people who come to the museum, even if they're not of Japanese descent, that they really find, points of connection or parallels with their own family history or community's history. Something I think that a lot of people, they feel like they don't like history because they, just were taught to memorize like dates. But I think family history is such an important way it's a way to find connection and get people interested. So I think that, we hope that people will connect with the exhibitions that we have here, the stories that we tell, and that it will somehow create empathy. And I think that's really what we need at this time, especially when just everything you hear about in current events, or, we know that democracy is so fragile and fraught these days. And so, I don't know. So I would say, yes, support all of the, the organizations that we put in the chat. And and as Dr. Fujita Roni said, like, listen too. And I think you'll find a lot of points of connection. Yeah.
Gosh, it's so true. And California's history, I mean, even, just reflecting personally in this job, understanding how, different communities have shaped California makes me really proud to live in this state and call myself a Californian. And I think your point is really well taken, which is, even if that's not part of our, individual history or background, learning about the Japanese American community or the diversity of Asian American communities is incredible, and it helps tell us the story of who we are and the place and the place where we live. So really excited by that. Lori, I want to ask you, if you had a magic wand, what would the future be for this, the priorities that we're talking about?
Oh my gosh. As to my particular property, or could you be
No,
more?
just generally. I mean, you're reflecting on this. You did this over 30 years. You've been doing this for a while. What do you hope for the future?
Well, I hope that more people do participate in going through the nomination process. And I was very fortunate in that I was able to get two great historic preservation people involved. And they dug up all kinds of information. So save the newspaper articles, don't throw anything away, save the magazine articles, save all the photographs. It's really important. And those are the things that you share with the consultants. And the more material you have, the better. And it's a process, and it takes a while, but you constantly review with your consultant the accuracies, and you give them feedback, and it's a process, but I think it's worth going through. So don't throw out those things that you think are piling up in boxes, because they become very useful.
Those are really important, archival resources like those that Kristen presented, the photos, incredible. Julie, we've heard and we've learned today that the history of Asian Americans is really underrepresented across the country, and probably in California. Yeah, certainly as it relates to, those places designated as places of historic and cultural importance. So what are we doing, or what should we be doing to ensure that this process to really call out and protect special places to our culture truly represents, all of our diverse cultures that make up California.
I think really by creating more of these studies, because they do really help with the time and the scholarship and the cost of these, a lot of communities find as prohibitive. Really reaching out to our communities. Our office is about to conduct our statewide historic preservation plan. And what are we looking at in the next 5 years? So we'll be reaching out, going to communities, sitting with you, having tea, asking you questions about your priorities. And as Dorothy said, really listen to what people are telling us and how we can understand from their perspective, what are their barriers to participation? How can we be helpful in telling the stories of their families and their ancestors and their neighbors? I think in those ways that we can help make the designation programs more accessible, and really help people understand the relevancy and the deep value that they have to so many things, rather than just marking something on a piece of paper. As Kristen said, in this time, I think that these stories help us to really raise our level of empathy for one another, and realize that we are more the same than different, that we all have a huge role, our communities, in creating the history of California that's so rich and diverse. And as waves of immigrants have come to the state over time, places have multiple layers of history in them, as we've seen in places like the Matavilla Handball Court in East LA, which was in a Latino community, a grocery store opened by a Japanese American when he came back from the camps and was really limited about where he could purchase and live, that became this de facto community center that sent boys, young men, to national handball championships. And as many testified when the nomination came to the State Historical Resources Commission, really saved their lives and showed them ways to live in a more peaceful and successful way. And so I think we just really have to understand the value and the depth and the importance of history, and make sure that we're doing a lot of listening to see what the communities want us to do on their behalf.
No, that's incredible. A comment was shared by an attendee that said that they have been to the Japanese American National Museum several times. And as a person not of Japanese ancestry, they found it to be a really visceral and moving experience. So to me, one of my takeaways is we all have a role to play, supporting leaders like those that we've heard from today, who are lifting up communities across California, our diverse histories across California in our own communities. To support these leaders, support the work, support historic designations when you hear about them or have an opportunity to support them. California is an incredible place, and we need to show the world, particularly at this time, that we succeed across all conceivable differences, and it's remarkable. So huge thanks to you all for all that you do. It's been a remarkable AAPI Heritage Month. We started with a public service project at a state park outside of Sacramento, the Marshall Gold Rush State Park, that was really important in California history, which was shaped by Chinese American and Asian Americans. We had a movie screening just yesterday at our headquarters, which was a remarkable story about Asian Americans in the American South. We're having a online career pathway discussion around how folks can get into these careers, and particularly recruiting from our diverse Asian American communities. So just exciting, and you all today helped us really breathe life into this culture, this history that we're really, really thankful for. So big thanks to everybody. Next week is June, and we will be celebrating Pride. So for those who are interested, please join us. We're going to have some really fun in-person events, including marching as an agency with our sister agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Sacramento Pride Parade. Lots of good stuff happening there. If you have suggestions, questions, comments for us, please send us an email on the email on the screen. And you can, again, find a recording of this discussion on our website tomorrow. Huge thanks to our panelists. As always, thanks to my colleague, Geeta Chandra, who helps produce these. Have a great day and have a great rest of the month. Take care.